Everyone thinks the First World War ended in 1919, that the Treaty of Versailles brought peace, justice, and a new world order. But the truth is that it didn't end the war. It just moved it from the battlefield to the balance sheet. The cannons went silent, but the debt kept firing. When the victors gathered in Paris to dictate terms to a defeated Germany, they believed they were writing a treaty. In reality, they were writing a promissory note, one that the entire continent would struggle to pay for the next 2 decades. The signatures on that paper were less about peace and more about payment. Behind every clause of reparation was a ledger entry, and behind every signature, a creditor waiting to collect. Here's the paradox. The winners of the war were bankrupt, and the losers were expected to pay their bills. Britain owed the United States more than £1 billion in war loans. France was crushed under reconstruction costs and its own American debts. The United States, meanwhile, had become the world's creditor, the new financial empire replacing London's old one. But to make that system work, someone had to provide cash flow. That someone was Germany, stripped of colonies, industry, and dignity, yet expected to fund the prosperity of others. So the Treaty of Versailles wasn't just a peace treaty, it was an invoice. It declared that Germany must pay 132 billion gold marks, roughly $33 billion at the time. A sum so enormous that even John Maynard Keynes, a British delegate, warned it would crush the life out of Europe. But no one listened. Politicians wanted revenge and bankers wanted repayment. Arithmetic didn't care. Think of it like this. You're forcing your bankrupt neighbor to pay your mortgage, using a currency that no longer exists, while the entire street's economy depends on him doing so. That was Europe in 1919. Gold-backed currencies, broken trade routes, and central banks scrambling to rebuild reserves that had been melted into bullets. And here lies the deeper twist. The war had destroyed Europe's wealth, but the treaty destroyed its ability to rebuild it. Every gold mark that left Germany drained liquidity from the entire system. The reparations were supposed to rebuild France, but they ended up destabilizing Britain. The gold standard, that sacred symbol of financial order, became a weapon of austerity. Money itself turned into a tool of punishment. By trying to make Germany pay for the war, the Allies made everyone poorer. Within a decade, the system they had created, built on impossible debts and political pride, collapsed into the global depression of 1929. The map of Europe was redrawn not by tanks, but by accountants. If this opened another side of history for you, comment where you're watching from. To understand how Europe bankrupted itself after the First World War, we have to look not at the trenches, but at the ledgers. Wars end when guns stop, but systems collapse when numbers stop making sense. And by 1919, Europe's numbers were madness written in gold ink. Let's rewind. Before the war, the world ran on a delicate mechanism, the classical gold standard. £1 sterling equaled a fixed weight of gold. Every banknote was a promise you could redeem in metal. It was a system built on trust, discipline, and the belief that credit could never outgrow the vaults of gold beneath it. London was the center of that world. Its banks financed half the planet, from Argentine railways to Indian opium. Then came 1914. When war broke out, the gold standard was suspended overnight. Governments printed money to buy steel, coal, and blood. Within months, entire economies were operating on paper promises. By 1918, the great European empires, British, French, Austrian, Russian, were hollowed out, not by defeat, but by inflation and debt. Now imagine the world in 1919. The United States holds more than 40% of the world's gold, its economy intact, its factories booming. Europe lies in ruins, and yet its politicians talk about reparations, as if wealth could simply be transferred from Berlin to Paris like a bank transfer. But here's the hidden engine behind it. The reparations system was never just about punishing Germany. It was about servicing Allied debts to America. Here's how the circuit worked. The Allies owed billions to the United States for weapons and food. They couldn't pay unless they received reparations from Germany. Germany, in turn, couldn't pay unless it borrowed money, and the only country rich enough to lend was America. So dollars flowed from New York to Berlin, from Berlin to Paris and London, and back to New York again. A perfect circle, or a financial treadmill. Economists later called it the transfer problem. Money wasn't really moving. It was being recycled through the illusion of repayment. Who designed this? Bankers, not generals. The Reparations Commission, an international body created by the treaty, functioned less like a political court and more like a collection agency. It decided how much Germany should pay, when, and how, even if that meant restructuring its economy. And the Bank of England, the Banque de France, and the Federal Reserve quietly coordinated behind the scenes, ensuring that the illusion of solvency continued. But systems like this have a fatal flaw. They depend on faith. Faith that debtors will pay, that creditors will wait, and that money will hold its value. Yet the numbers didn't add up. To meet the first year's payments, Germany had to export more than it imported, but the Allies had raised tariffs to protect their own industries. To send gold abroad, it had to drain its reserves, but the Reichsbank was already printing marks to feed its population. It was like trying to refill an empty bucket by pouring from another that had a hole. The mechanism looked sophisticated, but it was built on contradiction. And behind the polished speeches in Versailles, you can sense the quiet presence of another power, the emerging American financial empire. Wall Street, newly global, understood something Europe didn't. Whoever controls credit controls reconstruction. Through loans, bonds, and the promise of stabilization, the United States turned from a wartime supplier into the new metropole of capital. The age of London's dominance was over. The age of the dollar had begun. By 1920, the treaty had created not peace, but a pyramid. Debts stacked upon debts, each depending on the next to stay upright. Europe wasn't rebuilding, it was refinancing its ruins. The balance of power had shifted from soldiers to bankers. And if you listen carefully, you can hear the same hum today, the sound of nations borrowing to pay old promises, the illusion that debt itself is wealth. If this changed how you see the peace of 1919, tell me in the comments what country you're watching from. For a moment, it all seemed to work. The 1920s looked like a miracle. Europe rebuilding, factories roaring back to life, currencies stabilizing. Newspapers called it the return to normalcy. But what they didn't say was that it wasn't normal at all. It was an illusion, financed on borrowed time and borrowed dollars. Germany, the supposed pariah, suddenly became the darling of Wall Street. American banks, J.P. Morgan, National City, Dillon Reed, flooded Berlin with credit. Between 1924 and 1930, more than $2.5 billion flowed into Germany through foreign loans. Not because anyone believed in its prosperity, but because the financial system needed the illusion of German solvency to stay alive. Remember the circuit. Germany paid reparations to France and Britain. They paid their war debts to America, and America lent the money back to Germany. A self-feeding loop disguised as recovery. The facade was maintained by New Deals, the Dawes Plan of 1924 and later the Young Plan of 1929. Each plan reduced annual payments, stretched out the schedule, and encouraged foreign investment, polite code for American loans that kept the carousel spinning. Germany used those loans not to rebuild a self-sufficient economy, but to import goods, pay reparations, and keep its currency, the newly stabilized Reichsmark, from collapsing. For the average citizen, it felt like rebirth. Cafes reopened, Berlin's lights glittered again, and Europe rediscovered jazz, cinema, and the myth of endless progress. Governments congratulated themselves on restoring the gold standard, that old badge of financial honor. But this was not the pre-war gold standard of real convertibility. It was a gold exchange standard, a paper-gold hybrid where countries held not bullion, but US dollars and British pounds as reserves. In other words, promises built on promises. It was as if Europe had repainted the walls of a house whose foundation was still cracked. The glittering 20s were financed by invisible chains, interest payments, short-term loans, speculative bubbles. Every ton of coal, every shipment of machinery, every skyscraper in New York or factory in the Ruhr was mortgaged to a system that depended on permanent optimism. And optimism was cheap. Stocks soared, currency stabilized, and newspapers spoke of a new age of reason. Central bankers praised one another at conferences in Geneva. Even Keynes, who had once called Versailles a Carthaginian peace, was temporarily sidelined by the euphoria. Numbers on paper rose faster than the output of mines, farms, or factories. Credit was the new gold. But beneath the music, a low hum of arithmetic warned that something was off. If every nation owed money, and all payments depended on continued U.S. lending, what would happen if that credit stopped? What if the world's creditor suddenly demanded repayment? Few asked. It was easier to believe the good times would roll forever. That's the essence of every economic illusion, from the Mississippi bubble of 1720 to the housing booms of the 2000s. People mistake liquidity for wealth and debt for growth. Europe in the 1920s was no exception. The same bankers who once funded the war were now financing peace and earning interest twice, first on the destruction, then on the reconstruction. But systems built on borrowed confidence have a half-life. The moment one link breaks, a bank fails, a loan is recalled, or a currency wobbles, the whole chain begins to rattle. In the late 1920s, that rattle had already started. Capital fled, trade slowed, and invisible cracks began to show behind the roaring headlines. The 20s weren't golden, they were gold-plated. If this shattered the picture of Europe's recovery, drop a comment. What part of the world are you watching this from? Every illusion ends the same way, not with a bang, but with a balance sheet. The system Europe built after 1919 was brilliant in theory and fatal in math. You can delay payment, restructure loans, invent new plans, but you can't negotiate with numbers. By 1929, arithmetic caught up. It began quietly, as it always does. In America, the same credit that kept Europe alive started inflating its own stock market. Banks lent to speculators who borrowed against rising prices, who borrowed again, an echo of Europe's own debt carousel. When the Wall Street crash hit in October 1929, it wasn't just a financial panic. It was the unplugging of the entire reparations circuit. U.S. loans to Germany stopped overnight. Without new credit, Germany couldn't pay reparations. Without reparations, Britain and France couldn't pay America. The circle snapped. By 1931, the contagion spread. Germany's banks began to collapse, the Donut Bank first, then others. Foreign investors fled, taking gold and dollars with them. The Reichsmark plummeted, unemployment exploded. In Britain, the pound was forced off the gold standard, that proud symbol of sound money turned to lead. France tried to hold on longer, bleeding reserves to defend a price of gold that no longer reflected reality. The European economy was unraveling thread by thread. But here's the twist most history books soften. This wasn't a failure of morality or policy, it was the collapse of a design. The reparations system, built to make one nation pay for the war, had made everyone dependent on the same fragile flow of credit. It was like trying to power an entire city through one electric socket. When that socket shorted out, New York in 1929, the lights went out across Europe. Politicians tried to fix it the only way they knew, with meetings. The Hoover Moratorium of 1931, the Lausanne Conference of 1932, endless talks, endless statements about stability. But the math didn't care. Germany officially suspended payments. Britain defaulted on its war debts to the U.S. France's gold drained into the Atlantic. The continent was bankrupt in every sense, financially, politically, morally. And in that vacuum, something darker took root. Economic collapse breeds extremism faster than any ideology. In Germany, despair turned into anger, and anger found a uniform. The same reparations that were meant to prevent another war had instead laid the foundation for it. The Weimar Republic, born from Versailles, died from it. What's remarkable is how invisible the collapse looked at first. Newspapers still printed optimistic headlines. Politicians still promised temporary adjustments. But the real economy, factories, farms, families, was already shattered. Unemployment in Germany reached 6 million. In Britain, hunger marches filled the streets. France tightened its grip on gold while its people starved for credit. By 1933, Europe had come full circle, from war to peace, from peace to bankruptcy, from bankruptcy to dictatorship. The treaty that was supposed to end all wars had simply changed the uniforms of its soldiers. Bankers, bureaucrats, then generals again. Arithmetic had beaten politics. You can suspend parliaments, dissolve alliances, print money, but you can't repeal subtraction. If you're hearing this in 2025, look around. Debt pyramids, inflated markets, nations borrowing from tomorrow to pay yesterday. The shapes are new, but the law is the same. Systems don't collapse because of villains. They collapse when numbers stop obeying lies. If this made history feel uncomfortably familiar, tell me below what moment you think today's world rhymes with most. The Treaty of Versailles died long ago, but the world it created never did. It simply changed its language. The reparations, the inter-allied debts, the gold standard, they were all symptoms of a deeper mechanism, a system where money serves the creditor, not the creator. And that system still governs us. After the Second World War, the Allies learned from Versailles, or at least they said they did. The Bretton Woods system of 1944 was supposed to be its antidote: fixed exchange rates, stability, no more economic wars. But look closer. It was Versailles rebuilt in softer clothes. Instead of gold reparations, there were dollar obligations. Instead of the Bank of England and the Banque de France, there were the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Instead of punishing Germany, the world now obeyed Washington. The pattern stayed the same. Those who control credit dictate the terms of peace. In the 1920s, Germany borrowed from America to pay France. In the 2020s, entire continents borrow from the IMF to pay Wall Street. The names have changed. Reparations became structural adjustments, reconstruction loans, or financial stabilization. The moral tone softened, but the mathematics did not. Look at the numbers. In 1919, Germany's reparations were 132 billion gold marks, an impossible sum for a destroyed economy. A century later, global debt exceeds $300 trillion, and most nations owe not in gold, but in dollars, a currency they cannot print. Every central bank today faces the same dilemma as the Reichsbank did in 1923: maintain credibility or feed the people. The words change, the arithmetic doesn't. What Versailles did to Europe, the dollar system did to the world. The petrodollar became the new gold standard. Trade oil, hold dollars, obey interest rates set in another capital. And when crises hit, in Latin America in the 1980s, in Asia in 1997, in Greece after 2008, the script repeated: debt, austerity, social collapse, and foreign assistance. The balance sheets of empires always end the same way, with someone else paying the interest. Think of it this way. The Treaty of Versailles didn't just bankrupt Germany. It globalized the concept of financial obedience. Every bond, every IMF loan, every aid package today carries a clause that echoes 1919. You owe us, therefore you must obey us. Nations no longer lose wars by invasion. They lose them by refinancing. And here's the quiet irony. The reparations system collapsed when Germany could no longer borrow. Our modern system will collapse when the world's creditors can no longer lend. When debt outgrows production, as it already has, even the illusion of control fades. Versailles was arithmetic meeting pride. Today's financial order is the same equation, written in digital code. The names of the actors have changed: Deutsche Bank, the Fed, the ECB, the IMF. But the plot hasn't. Money flows uphill, risk flows downhill. The same moral inversion persists. The punished debtor, the righteous creditor. The illusion that discipline will fix what imbalance created. And just as in 1919, the political world follows the financial one. You can already see it. The anger, the nationalism, the resentment of invisible powers that dictate terms. People may not understand balance of payments theory, but they feel it when food prices rise because of interest rates in another hemisphere. Versailles taught us one truth: financial domination eventually breeds political revolt. If you're hearing this now, a century later, look at your own currency, your own debt, your own government's promises. The mechanism hasn't changed, only its disguise has. The empire of numbers that began with reparations still rules the world through rates, swaps, and deficits. And as before, it will end not in outrage, but in arithmetic. If this drew the line between 1919 and today for you, tell me, what modern system do you think carries the same curse of Versailles? History doesn't repeat, it compounds. Each generation inherits not the mistakes of the past, but their interest. The Treaty of Versailles wasn't just a political error, it was a spiritual one. It turned morality into mathematics and expected nations to live under equations that no human system could balance. We think wars end with signatures, but they don't. They end when trust returns, and that Versailles destroyed. The idea that peace could be purchased in gold instead of built on fairness was the original sin of the 20th century. It taught bankers to act like diplomats and politicians to think like accountants. Every subsequent crisis, the Depression, Bretton Woods, the Eurozone, the modern debt spiral, grew from that seed. When you read that Germany paid its reparations, what you're really reading is that it paid with the collapse of its middle class, the hyperinflation of 1923, and the rise of a man who promised revenge through order. Arithmetic became ideology, numbers weaponized. And today we are not so different. We wage our wars with interest rates instead of artillery. We talk about fiscal responsibility while printing trillions. We punish nations with sanctions instead of invasions. But behind all of it is the same illusion Versailles created, that balance sheets can enforce justice, that credit equals morality, that numbers can replace trust. The truth is simpler and harder. Systems don't collapse because people are evil. They collapse because the numbers stop believing the story. You can lie to voters, to investors, even to history, but not to arithmetic. When debt grows faster than value, when promises multiply faster than production, collapse is not a choice. It's a countdown. The Treaty of Versailles bankrupted Europe because it confused revenge with reality. It tried to turn loss into revenue and pain into policy. It failed, but it left a warning written in every crisis since. No empire survives the point where its money becomes fiction. If you're hearing this in 2025, know this: Versailles is not over. It lives in every spreadsheet where debt exceeds meaning, in every policy built on denial, in every promise that numbers can't keep. History doesn't need another treaty. It needs the courage to balance truth before the ledger balances us. If this made you see the past and the present with new eyes, share it. Because what broke Europe a century ago is breaking the world again, just with better accounting software.